Okay, the topic tonight is St. Thomas Aquinas' 5 ways of the existence of God, or Tommy's top tips for thinking theologically. So the existence of God can be demonstrated through reason alone in the following ways. Well, in the following ways after these little caveats at the beginning. So, a little explanation. So notice that none of these make any appeal to history, religion, or religious experience. Rather, they are thinking through of the conclusions that could be formed by a neutral observer simply noticing the ways that the world is. Think about, we think of the Greek philosophers. They had the Greek gods and Zeus and Olympus and all of that. The philosophers, and honestly most people, knew that the Greek gods weren't really a thing. They were just sort of a cultural construct. People knew that, but they did believe in a divine figure. If you read Plato or Aristotle, they speak of sort of a one divine person. Okay, they don't have a specific name for it, or there's certainly not any kind of sense of revelation like we would speak of as Christians. But it's, they thought about it, realized there kind of has to be something that's beyond us. This is Thomas Aquinas giving a really formalized way of that kind of thinking. It's really more properly philosophy than theology, even though I jokingly use theologically in that little jokey title of it. But I really just mean that in the very broadest sense. So theology, logi, logic, so thinking. Theo is the Greek word for God. So it's really just thinking logically about God things. So only in that very broad sense is this theology. You'd really more properly call it philosophy. So there's 5 arguments for, I say 5 arguments just for the existence of God. So the first one, the argument from motion. Okay, stuff moves. The Milky Way galaxy spins around a central black hole. The planets go around the sun. There has to be some power that sets everything in motion from the beginning. Some power that did not need to be moved first itself. You could call that the unmoved mover, the thing that which seems to need to exist for everything else to be moving. If you don't have an unmoved mover, you're left with just an infinite regression of, which is kind of a philosophical cop-out. Like it goes just there is no explanation. Like, well, we're looking for an explanation. So there is one, that there is an unmoved, the one that causes all the things to start moving, the one who, why is there heat and light in the universe? All things that make stuff move. Well, where did that come from? If you wanted to philosophize a lot further, you could say that, well, God is the source of the Big Bang, and so like he's the one who's the source, which I think makes sense, but this doesn't actually go that far. But that's kind of, if you wanted to really test the depths of that, you might end up there. But okay, there's energy and light and motion. Well, that had to come from somewhere. The sun is hot, but like where did all that motion come from? So that's the argument from motion. Things are moving, something had to make them start moving. Second one is related. The argument from causes. Everything is caused by something else. You were caused by a relationship between your parents. This house was caused because somebody built it. Your hair is the color it is, either because of your DNA caused it to be that way, or you bought a bottle of whatever and you colored it that way. The chromosomes cause the color of your hair. The ones that cause the color of your hair, they are caused by complex molecular structures, and those complex molecular structures are caused by the way individual atoms relate to each other, building in bonding relationships. And those atomic properties are caused by the number of protons, electrons, and neutrons. And the properties of those protons, neutrons, and electrons, they're caused by quarks and gluons. And you can part of physics keep going and going. There's always one more step of causes there. Everything is caused by something else, and the chain of causes, rather than just have to go back infinitely, because that's really not an answer, we say that there's a first cause, the first one who put things into, like, who caused the first thing, and therefore everything else goes after that. You could call that first cause something that could be called God. The third one, the argument from possibility and necessity. This one's definitely really philosophical, but it's I kind of like it. Think about it this way: you don't have to be like you are. Any of us very well could have been taller or shorter. We could have been, darker skin or lighter skin. We could have been, had better bones or stronger teeth or whatever. There are literally infinite possibilities for how you could have been. But you are a certain way that you're. There's only one way that you are. But there's no logical necessity, no immutable law of the universe, no necessary reason that requires you to be this way. You are this way, but you didn't have to be that way. Even further than that, though, things don't have to even exist at all. They don't have to be a certain way. They don't have to even exist at all. The Earth exists. These couches exist. The food Emma made for dinner exists. But it didn't have to, right? There's nothing that requires it to exist. We can imagine that this house doesn't exist, that the food didn't exist, right? We can imagine the Earth doesn't exist, right? There's nothing requiring them to exist. And yet, things do exist and exist a certain way. There's not a multiverse of infinite possible everythings that exist. There's one way that they exist, and that implies that there is one thing that by necessity always does exist, always has to exist, a necessary being, right? To be, to exist, right? Like nothing else has to exist, nothing else has to be the way it is, but things do exist and are the way that they are. So it at least implies that there is something beyond, some being that does have to exist, that is the necessary being, who we could call God. The one thing, the being, let's just use that, from which all possibilities exist. And, in a sense, possibilities were reduced from all the infinite possibilities down to the one that actually happened, that exists in general, and that there's a particular existence, implies that there is one who is beyond, who does need to exist, and who is the one who, in a sense, causes us to other ones. There's similar to the first two, that there's, if you go far enough back, you have to find something that makes everything else make sense. The last two kind of go the opposite direction. At least this one does. They argue from degrees of perfection. So we can always imagine something to be better than it is. If you look at my time in college, you can easily imagine a better student. Camden, for example, who has already finished all of her homework and is ready for finals week, right? You can imagine a better student than me. But you can imagine a better student than Camden even eventually too. I don't know who, but maybe there's somebody who's better than Camden at school. She better watch this, right? Or you can imagine a better athlete. Like Delaney could probably throw a baseball, somewhat, but I bet Garrett could throw one better. Right? We can imagine a better athlete, a spectrum of better athletes, right? This is more detached. Think of the wisest person you know. They're really wise, but you could think of somebody wiser still, right? Or think of the strongest person you know, but you could still think of someone stronger than that. There's always the possibility of someone, some being better, smarter, wiser, more powerful, stronger. So eventually, we arrive at the idea of a being that is infinitely powerful, infinitely wise, infinitely strong, infinitely everything. Well, that ends up, what else would you call some being that's all the infinitely good things except for God? But because we know that there is degrees of perfection, there is, okay food and much better food and most excellent five-star restaurant food. There is someone who can barely walk and someone who can run a marathon and someone who can run one of those hyper marathons. We always imagine there's always a spectrum. We can imagine that there is some infinite place in that spectrum that would have to be God. Finally, the argument from governance. So this one I like too. I don't dislike anything, but these last two really, for me, land a lot. So governance. So think about it this way: the universe is not mechanical, like a piece of equipment. Like it's not like the gears and levers that you just crank through, right? Animals are not like robots with gears and levers and engines. But neither is nature just a random soup of atoms that do nothing, right? There is a kind of order there. The laws of physics are not arbitrary, but they seem to work together in a kind of ordered way. Think of the periodic table. Like you can imagine, well, just different numbers of protons and atoms can make them there just be this this random soup of different density or different weights of atoms. But actually, they are organizable in a nice periodic table, right? They have qualities that fall into recognizable patterns. Now, is it a perfect grid? Is it just a 6 by 8 grid of squares and everything locks into that? No, it's not a mechanical system, but there is an order to the system, right? Trees have irregular parts, right? No tree is exactly the same. You have different curves, different branches, different root structure in a broad sense. No two trees are identical to each other, but all trees do have a common form: roots in the ground, a trunk that goes up, branches, leaves of some kind. Weird things like a cactus. They follow that same kind of pattern, right? So there's not just a soup of chaos. There's not just strictly mechanical things like we would make, but there is an order to the universe. The planets orbit in predictable ellipses. Baby animals, when they're born or whatever, they know, like a baby turtle knows to go to the ocean. Like, it makes sense to them. That being, they don't have to be told what to do. Your body turns this food into nutrition. Like, it just works, right? There's an order to the universe. Things function. This intelligible and regular pattern implies that there is some higher intelligence that made it to be the way it is. And that implies there's an absolutely intelligent being who made things the way they are. And if we have an absolutely intelligent being, that would make sense to call that God. That being would be God. Okay, so that's the 5 of them. Sometimes they're called proofs. I don't like to call them proofs because a proof really implies, like, if you hear it, like, boom, no questions. If you observe it, like, if I say, hey, I punched the TV, and like there's a fist mark in the TV, and I have broken glass in my hands, like, yeah, it's pretty good proof that I punched the TV, right? If we say proof that Uriel walked out the door, well, there he goes, right? So we can see that because he has to go to work. He's not just being rude. That we have proof that Uriel left. Like, it's pretty indisputable that he just walked out of the room. But these don't quite work like that. They're not that kind. They're strong arguments, right? They're very, I think, very compelling, but they're not absolute proofs, and we shouldn't treat them like that. But they are very substantial arguments. I think there's a good place. That's why they're philosophy, though, because they, again, are not absolute proofs, but they're, I think, very helpful to think through. So just go back to them again. The argument from governance, there's not just chaos and it's not just mechanical, but there is an order to the universe, and that implies an orderer, you might say. Degrees of perfection, we can always imagine better, wiser, stronger, and like that. Well, that implies there's a best, wisest, strongest being. That would certainly be God. Possibility of necessity, things exist and exist a certain way, but they don't have to. But that implies that some being, if you want to say, wants them to exist and to exist the way that they are. The argument from causes, things don't happen for no reason. Like, if this falls, it's because, well, A, because I let go of it, and B, because gravity pulled it down. There's causes that trace backwards. Everything's going to have a cause, but eventually you have to have a first cause. In relation to that as the first mover, energy, motion, light, all of that, it makes everything else go, but all that had to come from somewhere. And that implies that there is a first something that was the origin of all of that. So those are Thomas Aquinas' 5 ways, or Tommy's top tips for thinking theologically, if you're someone like Liv who likes that kind of thing. So again, not proofs. I think they're very good to have as something meaty to hold on to think about what God is and sort of where his place might be. Thank you.